What is your first impression of this woman? Is she white, black, or perhaps biracial? She's Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, wife of King George III of Great Britain and Ireland, and over the past few years, her skin colour has become the subject of intense debate, in part because of this picture and in part because of the TV show Bridgerton. So in today's video from History Calling, we're going to use all the original source material I could find to ask, was Queen Charlotte Britain's first black royal? And does it even matter? Princess Sophia Charlotte was born in the Palace of Miro in the Duchy of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, Germany in 1744. She came to England aged 17 in 1761, where she married George III just 6 hours after meeting him. They would have 15 children, of whom 13 survived infancy, and Charlotte eventually died at Kew Palace in 1818. I already have a video looking at her life story, which I'll leave linked below for you, so there won't be much else about her biography here. Instead, I'm going to look first at the origins of the story that she was biracial, then I'll examine what we know about her family tree, look at the surviving visual evidence of her looks, and finally read out written descriptions to you from those who saw her in real life. Where possible, I will of course show you the original evidence so that you can interpret it for yourself. Section 1. The origins of a theory. The idea that Queen Charlotte was black, biracial, mixed race, or multiracial — there are a lot of different descriptive terms used when people discuss this topic, which is why you'll hear me saying different things as I don't want to privilege one over the other — was apparently first floated back in 1929 by German author Brunhilde Springer, then picked up again in 1940 by a man by the name of J.A. Rogers. Annoyingly, I couldn't get either of their books to double-check this, but I did find a reference to the theory in a newspaper article from the Indianapolis Recorder in 1945, which cited Rogers. It only really gained traction, though, when another man named Mario de Valdes y Cocum — I'm sorry, I know I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly — picked it up and published an article on Charlotte on PBS's Frontline website in 1997. It then received a publicity boost in 2018 when Prince Harry married Meghan Markle, Duchess of Sussex, and again with the arrival of the TV show Bridgerton in 2020, in which Queen Charlotte, who's almost the only historical figure in this otherwise fictional tale, is portrayed by black actress Golda Rosheuvel and by India Amartifio in the Bridgerton prequel, which looked at Charlotte's early marriage. I'm going to leave a link to de Valdes y Cocum's article in the description box, but I would urge you to read it with extreme caution, as it is absolutely littered with problems, many of which I'll discuss in this video. You should also be aware that the version of it you see on the website today has been amended since it was originally published. There is a note at the top of the webpage which reads, "This article, originally written in 1997, was updated on March 11, 2021, with clarifications and to remove outdated language around race." Fortunately for us, I have a copy of the previous version, so I'll be calling out some of the differences for you as we go along, several of which are very important. As well as the fact that it has been altered from the original text quoted by many other websites between 1997 and 2021, the article also has no footnotes, and the 1997 version has no in-text citations. De Valdes y Cocum also makes a number of statements which he presents as facts, but he doesn't offer any sources to support them, and that's a huge danger sign. He claims that there are at least half a dozen quotes from contemporaries pointing to Charlotte's mixed heritage, but only mentions 2, both of which I'll discuss in a little while, along with some other quotes. And he makes errors like claiming initially that a man named Baron Stockmar was the Queen's personal doctor, which he wasn't, though this error was changed in the later version of the article to say that he was the royal family's doctor. Also not entirely true, but we'll be coming back to Stockmar later on. Then there are the assertions that when Elizabeth II ascended to the throne, the royal household pointed out her African and Asian family tree. I've never seen this anywhere else, and like the rest of his article, it has no source to support it. The 2021 version of the article also changes the text to say that this claim was made in 1956, not 1953, and add in the assertion that her supposed African heritage was, quote, through Zeta, the wife of Alfonso VI of Castile. It might also add in a citation here by saying, "Entitled Royal Blood it is by Sir Rupert Ian K. Moncrieff and Dawn Pottinger," but honestly, the text is so badly written and formatted on the website that it's hard to know what the author is trying to say. If you read it, I think you'll see what I mean. The whole article, in fact, is just a pile of slop in my opinion, and it contains other bizarre statements which I'll discuss as we go along and they become relevant. In addition to how bad this article is, de Valdes y Cocum's credentials as an historian appear to be sorely lacking. From pulling together information given at the end of the Frontline article and in newspaper articles in The Guardian in 2009 and The Washington Post in 2020, he seems to have grown up in Belize and moved to the States and started researching Charlotte in 1967. He's variously described as an independent historian and, quote, an historian of the African diaspora. I don't see any evidence that he has any training as a historian, however, and the low quality of the Frontline article certainly suggests to me that he doesn't. He doesn't put doctor in front of his name, indicating no PhD, but even those with an undergraduate degree in history would be expected to understand that you don't make things up and you do need to provide references. I also can't find any peer-reviewed publications by him. If you're unfamiliar with peer review, it's the system by which scholars in all fields get their work published and recognised as authoritative, and it involves the manuscript of your work being sent out to usually at least 2 experts in the field to check the quality of research and writing and make sure that you're making a new contribution to your discipline and not just regurgitating what other people have already said. It's essentially a quality control measure. De Valdes y Cocum doesn't appear to have ever been able to get his theories published by a reputable scholarly outlet, though I don't know if he even tried, and I'm happy to be corrected on this if anyone out there knows different and can prove it. In fact, all I found from him online was the Frontline piece and a couple of quotes given to the Washington Post in 2020. As for real professional historians, any time I've seen one quoted discussing this story, they have always been sceptical about the claims. Nor have I ever seen anyone else publish any peer-reviewed work which supports this theory. The closest I've come is a book written by an American woman named Stephanie Myers entitled Invisible Queen. This had me quite excited for a minute, however, red flags went up when I did a bit more digging and discovered that the book is self-published by Dr. Myers and her husband's publishing firm, so almost certainly it wasn't peer-reviewed. Not that I mind self-publishing in theory, I've done it myself, but it can be very hit and miss. I also discovered that while Dr. Myers is absolutely a very clever and successful woman with many accomplishments to her name, including an impressive career in government, her PhD is in applied management and decision sciences, not history, and in an interview she gave, she openly admitted that history is not her background and hadn't been her interest. In fact, it was her research into her personal genealogy which led her to Charlotte when she came across a portrait of her. She's also said that her research was done in books in libraries and on the internet. No mention of any archives, which is not what you want for a book like this, making claims like these. The timing of her book's publication, when Prince Harry and Meghan Markle had just become engaged and there was a lot of buzz around Charlotte, also seemed rather convenient, shall we say. I was unable to get the book, however, as it was literally listed at £500 on Amazon, but if anyone else has it and could give me some idea of the quality of her research and what her sources for Charlotte's family tree in particular are, that would be brilliant. All I could see was the 76-word Amazon description, and even that contained several factual and grammatical errors, including Charlotte's name, so I suspect the quality of the book is pretty darn low. So I've never seen any credible historians support this theory, and the self-proclaimed historians I'm aware of who have done so appear to be rank amateurs. But what is the supposed evidence for Charlotte being black or mixed race that they cite, and why do I think that it is so weak? Section 2. Charlotte's Genealogy. Speaking about the Queen's family tree, Maria de Valdes y Cocum claimed in 1997 in Frontline that 6 different lines can be traced from English Queen Charlotte back to Margarita de Castro y Sousa, who was a 13th century member of what he calls a black branch of the Portuguese Royal House. He then claimed that royal inbreeding meant that despite a gap of 9 generations, Charlotte still retained a, quote, unmistakable African appearance. He provided no sources to support this idea though, nor can I find anything elsewhere that backs it up either. Furthermore, by 2021, the article had been changed to read that at least 492 lines of descent can be traced from Queen Charlotte through her triple ancestry from Margarita de Castro y Sousa to Martin Alfonso de Sousa Chicoro, the illegitimate son of King Alfonso of Portugal and his Moorish mistress, Oriana/Madrigana. Interestingly enough, in a gene pool that was comparatively minuscule due to royal inbreeding, it was from Martin Alfonso de Sousa's wife, Inés de Valadares, that the British Queen inherited most of her African Islamic ancestry. Now, this change in claims is a real mess, and if you can follow what on earth the paragraph I just read out to you means, good on you, because I found it nearly incomprehensible. Between 1997 and 2021, we seem to have gone from 6 lines of descent between Margarita de Castro y Sousa and Queen Charlotte to 3 lines of descent, not ancestry like the article says, from Margarita, and 492 lines connecting the Queen to some guy called Martin plus his mum, his dad and his wife. There is no explanation as to how Margarita and Martin are connected, and Valdes y Cocum seems unable to decide if the important black ancestor he's claiming for Charlotte is Margarita, a Moorish woman called either Oriana or Madrigana, her daughter-in-law Isabella, or all of them. This is just one reason that this is a car crash of an article, in my opinion. Thankfully, if we look at an article in the Washington Post from 2020, we find that in that case, de Valdes y Cocum did explain what he was talking about with regards to this supposed ancestry a bit more clearly. There he is quoted as saying that both Margarita and Charlotte were also descended from the 13th century King Alfonso III of Portugal and his concubine named Oriana, which is now spelled a different way to the Frontline article because academic consistency is for losers, right? She was supposedly a, quote, black Moor from Faro, but again, no sources are mentioned. Now, I don't speak Portuguese, and I don't have access to the Portuguese archives to check these family trees. It's possible that Queen Charlotte was descended from these women, but that doesn't mean they were black, and even if they were, I struggle to believe that she, at a remove of over 300 years, still retained so-called African features as a result of her descent from them. This view is supported by an article in The Critic from February 2020 by writer and historian Lisa Hilton, who points out that Moor did not necessarily refer to a person of African descent, but as a general term to the inhabitants of the Moorish Empire in North Africa and Spain. We have no idea of what Mandragana, and she does say Mandragana, not Madrigana, looked like. She may have had Berber, Spanish, Arabic, or indeed African features, but she might equally have had blonde hair and blue eyes, as after the fall of the Roman Empire, tribes from northern Europe, including East Germany and Scandinavia, invaded the Moorish kingdoms. Moreover, the 500 years between Mandragana and Charlotte would suggest any African bloodline would have been significantly diluted. The problems with interpreting the words Moor or Blackamoor as synonymous with black are further pointed out in a 2017 article in the Philadelphia Inquirer, in which Dr. Anya Lumba, who was at that point teaching race and colonialism at the University of Pennsylvania and who has published a book on colonialism and post-colonialism, said that the word blackamoor in Shakespeare's time meant Muslim. It didn't mean black necessarily. Moors could be white from North Africa. So de Valdes y Cocum and his adherents apparently don't even understand what the terms they are using actually mean in an historical context, which greatly undermines any suggestion that Charlotte's ancestors were actually black, even if we did believe in the very sparse and unreferenced genealogy he provided. In fact, I've never even seen a proper family tree provided by him. None was forthcoming in the Frontline article, and the only one I found for Charlotte, which goes back this far, is by an anonymous author on Wikipedia, which is hardly a trustworthy source. It shows only one line of descent and provides no sources to support it. Even if there truly were 3 or 6, though, and allowing for royal inbreeding, I don't think that someone retains the features of such a distant ancestor. How much do you think Prince George, Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis of Wales look like Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, for instance, despite being only, in inverted commas, 7 generations apart, and despite the verifiable inbreeding in the royal family within those generations? Victoria and Albert were first cousins, for instance, and both Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip were their direct descendants. The kind of inbreeding required to maintain dark skin over the course of several centuries would be catastrophic. In fact, it only takes a few generations of inbreeding to lead to dire results. Just see my video on Don Carlos of Spain, stepson to Mary I of England, for an example. Even aside from the fact that Valdes y Cocum has misunderstood what the word Moorish means with reference to Madrigana, I find his other reasoning, if we could even call it that, for supposing that Margarita was Black Portuguese utterly bizarre. He writes that he believes that the 15th century Sousa family were black because 2 historians, who he doesn't name and whose supposed work he doesn't cite, have established that unspecified Flemish portraits of the 3 wise men from the biblical nativity story, which he doesn't show but which apparently depict them as black men, must have been based on visiting members of the Sousa family, because how else would the Flemish artists have known what black people looked like? If that sounds insane, it's because it is. So, in a nutshell, Charlotte's links to Margarita de Castro y Sousa, Madrigana and Isabella may be legitimate, but they're totally unverified as far as I can tell, as is the skin colour of the latter 3 women, and the idea that Charlotte was heavily inbred and descended from Margarita 3 or 6 times over to the point that she still looked like her. De Valdes y Cocum has never supplied, as far as I can tell, a full family tree, let alone a verified one, complete with primary sources, or slam dunk descriptions of the supposedly black people on it from the historical record, or DNA analysis of any of the remains of any of the main players in this story, which, to be fair, is probably impossible to get, but the family tree certainly should have been provided. The guys had nearly 30 years to come up with it. I want to see manuscripts from the archives showing the line of descent between these people who lived in the 13th century and Charlotte's birth in the 18th. Saying she's related to them however many times over means absolutely nothing without high-quality evidence to back it up. Until I see said evidence, the family tree has all the credibility of a Grimm's fairy tale. Fortunately, not all family trees have to be fairy tales though. If you have Irish ancestry like me and would like to create a far more credible map of your own genealogy than anything we've seen for Charlotte, one based on actual primary sources, then you should check out my book, Find Your Irish Ancestors Online, which is available from Amazon as an ebook and paperback and is linked below for you. If you do decide to purchase it, I'd also be very grateful if you would leave a review of it on Amazon, as hardly anyone does, but they are so valuable for that platform's algorithm and other potential buyers. If you join my free mailing list on my website, historycallingofficial.com, you can also get 2 complimentary downloads, one of which is about interviewing family members about your family tree, and the other of which will help you to spot bad history versus good, which seems particularly appropriate given that I think this whole Charlotte was black theory is an example of pseudo-history that a lot of people have been duped by. Okay, let's move on. Section 3. Contemporary Images of Charlotte. A portrait of the Queen by Scottish artist Sir Alan Ramsay, in which we see her in coronation robes, has been the focus of much debate over Charlotte's skin colour. There are several versions of this portrait with an apparently darker skin tone than would be expected for her in existence, including in the Indianapolis Museum of Art and the National Portrait Gallery in London. I'm going to use the Indianapolis version because they provide a nice, good quality public domain photograph of it. There's also an image of her in profile, and this one of her by Ramsay held at St John's College, Oxford, which might also suggest darker skin. Stephanie Myers, who's black herself and so certainly experienced with black hair textures, said that she sees Charlotte's hair as indicating that she was biracial, and certainly it is curly in Ramsay's coronation portrait of her. Numerous portraits also show her with full lips, which some have pointed to as a supposed sign of biracial heritage. So what are we to make of these images? Well, the first thing I would point out is that the vast majority of painters who created portraits of the Queen portray her as white. De Valdes y Cocum claimed in 1997 that this is because, quote, artists of that period were expected to play down, soften, or even obliterate undesirable features in a subject's face, adding in 2021 that this was especially the case for women. Now, I agree that this is something that happens sometimes. No one wants to pay a fortune for a portrait that makes them look ugly, and Charlotte was reputedly very plain. Her chamberlain, Colonel Disbrow, would give her a very backhanded compliment in later life by saying that, I do think the bloom of her ugliness is going off, and her poor looks even earned her a call-out at the beginning of Charles Dickens' 1859 novel A Tale of Two Cities. It is set during George III's reign, and in paragraph 2 he says that at the time, there were a king with a large jaw and a queen with a plain face on the throne of England. Ouch. He said nothing about her skin colour though, and the sheer quantity of images which show her as white compared to the relative dearth of those which supposedly depict her as biracial is striking. In addition, an image by Frances Coates in the Royal Collection shows the Queen with one of her children, both looking decidedly white, and it was described by Lady Mary Coke, who knew the Queen well, as being so like that it could not be mistaken for any other person. She evidently didn't think that the pale skin colour was wrong. We must also question Ramsay's ability and his motives. Reading through his entry on the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, the evidence as to his skill as a painter is strong, and I definitely view him as an accomplished artist perfectly capable of rendering his subject accurately. Indeed, he would hardly have earned a royal commission if he couldn't. We must then ask why Charlotte might appear biracial in his work if she wasn't. Just before I offer you several potential answers to that question, please remember to like and hype the video and subscribe to my channel with the notification bell switched on so YouTube lets you know about my uploads. For bonus material from me, you can also join my YouTube membership or find me on patreon.com/historycalling, where I provide perks like early access to ad-free videos and extra podcasts. Thank you too to those of you who support the channel using the thanks button underneath videos, as this is very much appreciated and helps me to keep doing what I'm doing. One of the simplest answers as to why Charlotte appears darker in the Indianapolis portrait and others like it is that perhaps Alan Ramsay didn't paint them, or at least not all of them. The coronation portraits were widely reproduced and sent all over Britain, Ireland and beyond, and the ones that show her a little darker are far from being the only copies. I've seen versions in the Royal Collection in the King's Gallery in London, in Hillsborough Castle in Northern Ireland, and in Dublin Castle, for instance, and we know from a quote by Ramsay himself in 1766 that it is the Royal Collection Trust version in which Charlotte is noticeably paler than the Indianapolis painting, which is the original pattern for this image. He said, "Soon after Her Majesty's arrival, she likewise did me the honour to sit to me, and these two pictures in coronation robes are the originals from which all the copies ordered by the Lord Chamberlain are painted." It is entirely possible that it was one of his assistants who painted this, or at least had enough input into it to select the paint for the face and just happened to accidentally choose a shade which was a little too dark. The Oxford Dictionary of National Biography notes that Ramsay had plenty of helpers to create images of the royal couple, and a visitor to his studio once commented that, "I have seen his showroom crowded with portraits of His Majesty in every stage of their operation. The ardour with which these beloved objects were sought for by distant corporations and transmarine colonies was astonishing. The painter, with all the assistance he could procure, could by no means satisfy the diurnal demands that were made in Soho Square upon his talents and industry." If Ramsay was so run off his feet when it came to portraits of King George, I have no trouble believing that demand for images of the Queen was similar. As for other portraits of her in which she might seem a little darker, we might also wonder if she actually was less pale on the days she sat for those images, for no other reason than that she picked up a slight tan. De Valdes y Cocum also focuses on the fact that Ramsay supported the abolition of slavery, and that through his second marriage he was an uncle of Dido Elizabeth Bell, an illegitimate daughter born in 1761 to his wife's brother Sir John Lindsay and Maria Bell, a black slave from the British West Indies. You might therefore try to argue that he painted Charlotte in such a way as to make her look biracial in order to make a point about the inherent wrongness and cruelty of slavery and racism by placing a biracial woman at the apex of British society. Perhaps this argument goes, Charlotte, who was anti-slavery herself, even requested or agreed to this. Honestly, though, I don't find this very likely. As we've seen in other versions of the same portrait, Charlotte is paler, and Ramsay would have been liable to get himself into serious trouble for portraying the Queen of Great Britain and Ireland as something she wasn't, especially as a quick look at the provenance of this specific image shows that it was initially owned by the royal family itself. It wasn't sent to some far-flung corner of the British Empire, and it didn't reach America until the 1960s. Also, Ramsay's niece, Dido, didn't come to England until 1765, so her existence was unlikely to be motivating his painting work several years earlier. Charlotte, meanwhile, was just a teenager when the coronation painting was commissioned, as well as a new queen in a new country, still learning English. I'm not sure she would have been as forward as this, especially so early in her marriage, nor would she have been willing to risk the kind of censure that being portrayed as anything other than white would have brought on her and her children. There is another explanation, though, as to why the Indianapolis portrait and the small number of others, which show her a little darker than usual, have her looking slightly different to other images, and that is that we aren't seeing the colouring that the artist originally intended us to. Perhaps the paint has slightly changed colour over time due to the effects of ageing, or the portrait was covered in varnish which has darkened the colour of the paint across the entire image. Think about how different Hans Holbein's portrait of Anne of Cleves in the Louvre Museum looked before its restoration in the early 2020s, for instance, and how much more vibrant the colours were afterwards. There is also a great YouTube channel, which I think is well worth checking out, called Baumgartner Restoration. It shows the restoration of artworks and demonstrates very dramatically sometimes how wildly different a painting, including a subject's skin colour, can look after a professional cleaning to remove things like old varnish, dirt and overpainting. Now, I don't know if the Indianapolis version of Charlotte's coronation portrait or the other portraits of her I've showed you require restoration, or if we're seeing the original paint colours that the artist intended. But at the very least, I think we'd need to rule out the possibility that they need to be restored, especially as other versions of the coronation image show Charlotte with much paler skin. Regarding her hair, if I take you back to the profile view and ask you to look a little closer, you can see that her curls are actually a product of styling. The hair at the edge of her hairline where it meets her forehead is straight, then moves into curls once it's about an inch away from her scalp. Equally, the hair behind the tiara on the back of her head is also straight and wrapped up in a twist. This wasn't an unusual style. Here's a 1749 portrait of the very pale Marie Joseph of Saxony, Dauphine of France, with the same type of curls. Artificial curls weren't just for women either. You can see them in images of men in this period too, even if they were on wigs. Furthermore, plenty of other images of Charlotte show her with straight hair, and if you're going to argue that she used some early version of straightening irons to make her curls go away, then you also have to concede that she could absolutely have curled her straight hair. In fact, that wouldn't even require irons. You can curl your hair by wrapping it in rollers while it's wet and letting it dry like that. As for citing the full lips that you can see in the portrait as evidence of mixed heritage, I find this very unconvincing. Just think of someone like Angelina Jolie, a white woman who has a famously impressive pout and who also, like Charlotte, has brown hair and blue eyes. Before anyone tries to claim she's had fillers, by the way, there are images and footage of her as a child which show that her lips are natural, and her blonde-haired, pale-skinned daughter Shiloh has inherited this trait too. So can we please stop trying to claim that white people can't have full lips? It's demonstrably untrue and arguably even racist in my opinion to try to put someone into a particular ethnic group based on something like that. Next, we have the many caricatures of Charlotte and her husband printed by the British press during their lives. Now, you might argue that official portrait painters softened out subjects' less attractive features and maybe even made them appear paler, but caricature artists most certainly did not. They sought to exaggerate people's features, especially those which were perceived as bad. The drawing you see here actually isn't too offensive to Charlotte's looks, all things considered, but others were absolutely merciless and vulgar. Take this one depicting the king and queen on a latrine. As you can see, the press had no restraints. If there had been even a hint that Charlotte was anything other than white in the deeply racist world of the 18th and 19th centuries, that fact would have been immediately, loudly, and continually commented on. But it wasn't. Even caricatures of the Queen, which were vicious in their depiction of her, making fun of her wide mouth, nevertheless show no signs that she was anything other than a white woman. Myers mentioned that she had found one that depicted the Queen as black, but it's difficult for me to comment on this without knowing what image she is referring to. If the very odd one did depict her with darker skin, however, I would question if this was a pushback against her for her anti-slavery abolitionist views. Then there is the statue of the Queen in Queen's Square in London. Once thought to be Queen Anne, it is now acknowledged to be Charlotte, and newspaper reports from 1775, when she was 31, show it was being erected at that point. It too gives no hint of any biracial heritage in her features, and as it was created during her lifetime and erected in the city in which she was living most of the time and whose inhabitants would have known what she looked like, there is every reason to believe it accurate. Finally, images of her immediate birth family, including her parents and siblings, are also in existence and do not indicate to me that the family was visibly biracial. Stephanie Myers has talked about these pictures in a radio interview and said that she does see them as biracial, though she calls them fair and also uses a word which I doubt I can say on YouTube. It starts with M and ends in TO, and I'm just going to hope that you know what I mean because I'm not prepared to risk demonetization for it, even though I am quoting a black woman saying it in an educational context. Now, we must concede that different people can see different things in portraits because I disagree with her assessment. Portraits of her children also show what I think are very clearly white people. Furthermore, one of her daughters, Princess Mary, even lived long enough to have her photograph taken in the 1850s, in which she also appears white. Section 4. Comments by Contemporaries. Now let's look at what people who saw the Queen in real life thought of her appearance. The Washington Post says that de Valdes y Cocum found a quote from a Prime Minister who supposedly said of Charlotte that her nose is too wide and her lips too thick. The name of the Prime Minister isn't given, and there's no source. For those reasons, I'm going to discount that supposed quote right here, and also point out that even if it is true, a wide nose and full lips wouldn't indicate a person's skin colour. It's just a racist stereotype to suggest that only black or biracial people will display those features, and I've already demonstrated that white people can have full lips too. Honestly, I hope I don't need to tell you that they can have all different types of noses as well. If you doubt that, just walk down a street in a country with plenty of white people in it and look around. You'll see the wide variation in nose shapes very quickly. An early and much more reliable description of Charlotte comes from a newspaper report published in Lloyd's Evening Post on the 21st to 24th of August 1761, which reads, "In a letter from Mecklenburg to a merchant in town, we have the following description of the Princess of Strelitz. She is of a middling size, rather inclining to tall, a fine shape, graceful carriage, fine neck and hands, brown hair, round face, blue eyes, mouth rather large, rosy lips, and extreme fine teeth, which appear when she smiles or speaks." No mention here of anything which suggests biracial heritage. When she arrived in England the following month, Horace Walpole saw her and also left a description of the 17-year-old, which contains one crucial word. He said, "She is not tall nor a beauty, pale and very thin, but looks sensible and is genteel. Her hair is darkish and fine, her forehead low, her nose very well, except the nostrils spreading too wide. Her mouth has the same fault, but her teeth are good." If you haven't guessed already, it's the word pale which really sticks out to me here, as it's a direct reference to her skin tone and strongly suggests a Caucasian girl. His description of her hair as fine, with no mention of curls, also further refutes the idea that she had so-called African textured hair. As for her lips, like the newspaper article, Walpole says that her mouth was wide, but makes no comment on the thickness of her lips, and as I've already said repeatedly, I don't think having full lips means anything anyway. Though her nostrils apparently flared too much for his liking, again, there is no comment on the width of her nose, and in fact he says that it looked very well. This isn't a remark he would have been likely to make if her nose had been too wide to conform to the notions of beauty common to the era, or if it had fitted in with the racial stereotype then popular that those who were black or biracial automatically had wider noses than Caucasians. Mario de Valdes y Cocum mentions two further comments in the Frontline article. One comes from Baron Christian Friedrich Stockmar, who you'll remember the author incorrectly identified as Charlotte's physician in 1997 and later called the royal family's physician in 2021. He was in fact the doctor to Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, who was Charlotte's grandson-in-law and later King of the Belgians. The relevant quote comes from Stockmar's memoirs and records his impression of the Queen as being, quote, small and crooked with a true M face. M stands for that same word I didn't use earlier. Now at first glance this definitely seems like pretty solid evidence of Charlotte being biracial, but let's go deeper. Stockmar doesn't explain what he means by the M word he uses. Is it a reference to Charlotte's skin tone or to some particular feature of her face? Let's also think about when he saw her. He only came to England in 1816, and this entry in his diary apparently refers to a point in 1818 when Charlotte was ill and would in fact soon be dead. I say apparently because the quote comes from his translated memoirs, not from the original diary, which is in German. I've read, however, that when it was used in Alwyn Headley's 1975 biography of Charlotte, Headley did specify that it was from that point in her life, i.e. 1818. I wasn't able to get that book myself, though, to confirm that detail, and I found a discrepancy about when in Charlotte's life it refers to, as Lisa Hilton discounted the quote because she said it supposedly referred to what Charlotte looked like at birth, and Stockmar was decades younger than her and so couldn't have seen her at birth. I have an easier time believing it belongs to the end of her life, though, as you surely wouldn't call a newborn, who we know did not have anything like scoliosis, small and crooked. Furthermore, if Charlotte was old and desperately ill, this might help to explain an appearance which Stockmar found displeasing and used a racial epithet to insult, just as people today will insult someone using, for example, gender or sexuality-based insults, without these insults having any basis in truth. The other quote de Valdes y Cocum mentions in Frontline is a poem written at the time of Charlotte's coronation, which was immediately after her wedding according to the 1997 version of his article, and 2 weeks after it according to the 2021 version. It describes her as, descended from the warlike Vandal race, she still preserves that title in her face. Again, I think Lisa Hilton in The Critic explains this well by noting that the Vandals were East Germanic and not native to the sections of North Africa which they conquered in the 5th century. She also correctly points out how common it was for a person's ancestry to be praised in poetry dedicated to them, and I would add that I've seen this done too, both in poetry and when books were dedicated to someone, whether they were royal or not. As she says, Charlotte's being descended from the Vandals, quote, has no bearing whatsoever on the colour of her skin. Once again, we're seeing the problems which arise when pseudo-historians who don't understand historical terminology and don't bother to go away and learn about it run amok. The Washington Post also says that de Valdes y Cocum found a quote from famous poet Sir Walter Scott, in which he called Charlotte ill-coloured. I hunted down this remark, which comes from Volume 6 of Scott's memoirs. For context, Scott is describing a visit to Windsor Castle in October 1826, in which he noted that there are some fine paintings and some droll ones. Among the last are those of divers princes, the word divers means many, of the House of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, of which Queen Charlotte was descended. They are ill-coloured, orangutan-looking figures with black eyes and hook noses in old-fashioned uniforms. So the ill-coloured remark doesn't refer to Charlotte at all. It refers to paintings of some unnamed relatives of hers which appeared droll, meaning funny or strange, to Walter Scott because of their outdated uniforms, ugly noses and black eyes. Ill-coloured in this context might simply mean that the paint selected to create the portraits didn't produce a realistic effect, or that the paintings were old even then and needed a professional cleaning. It's by no means clear that it's a comment on the subject's skin, and even if it was, again, we're not talking about Charlotte here. What about that horrible orangutan comment, though? This is certainly racist to modern eyes, but it doesn't refer to Charlotte, and again, we don't actually know what Scott meant by it. He clearly didn't think the portraits were good, so does he mean that they are so poorly painted that the proportions of the figures are wrong, giving the appearance that their arms are too long, just as orangutans have long arms compared to the rest of their bodies? Even if it was a reference to the skin of the men in the paintings, it could suggest a range of things, including an olive or tan skin tone, neither of which was prized by the beauty standards of the day, because pale skin indicated you were wealthy and didn't have to work outdoors. Anne Boleyn, for instance, who no one with any wit doubts was white, was criticised for having a sallow complexion. Basically, we're a long way from Scott saying the family were biracial. In fact, had Charlotte been so, this would have been an obvious place for him to mention it, but he doesn't. Section 5. Conclusions and Final Thoughts. So where does this leave us? Well, in my opinion, the weight of the evidence points to Queen Charlotte looking white to those who saw her. There are certainly some outstanding questions that I'd like answers to, most notably around her family tree and whether her ancestors were actually black, but even if they were, I very much doubt, given the number of generations between them and Charlotte, that she appeared multiracial. The best evidence of this supposed status is the Indianapolis version of Sir Allan Ramsay's coronation portrait of her and the Baron Stockmar quote, and I've shown why both of these need to be treated with caution. They also have to be set against the veritable mountain of evidence indicating she was white. I certainly don't subscribe to the argument that she was visibly biracial and that hardly anyone in the worlds of art, press, politics, the aristocracy and the royal household ever mentioned or showed it. That kind of decades-long countrywide cover-up is just preposterous. Does it really matter, though, what colour Charlotte was, given that she has been dead for well over 200 years? Well, I think that it does. In researching this video, it was clear to me that this is a very emotive issue for many people and an idea that they are desperate to hold on to. In an article in the Radio Times in May 2024, actress Adjoa Andoh, who plays Lady Danbury in Bridgerton, was quoted as saying, "Queen Charlotte, as some people know and some people may not know, was the descendant of Alfonso III of Portugal and his African mistress, so she was mixed race. It's very nice to see some of that history woven in." Now, as I've shown throughout this video, I don't think it's real history being woven in, I think it's made up. But Miss Andoh apparently genuinely believed it was real and was happy to see it on screen, and I'm throwing no shade at her, by the way. She's an actor, not an historian after all. If you search for the hashtag Queen Charlotte on the likes of X and Instagram, you'll see many people confidently asserting that she was definitely either black or biracial too. You'll see similar comments if you look beneath the biography video I did of Charlotte, in which I barely mentioned this theory, yet it attracted a huge number of often very rude remarks from people insisting with, as I hope I have now shown, no real evidence that this theory is true and complaining that I hadn't gone down the rabbit hole with them. Some of the inhabitants of the town of Charlotte in North Carolina, which is named after the Queen, have also expressed their certainty in her black heritage. The 2009 article in The Guardian quoted the wife of the local congressman as saying, "I believe African-American Charlotteans have always been proud of Queen Charlotte's heritage and acknowledge it with a smile and a wink. Many of us are now enjoying a bit of 'I told you so' now that the story is out." The congressman himself was quoted as saying, "In private conversations, African-Americans have always acknowledged and found a sense of pride in this secret. It's great that this discussion can now come out of the closet into the public places of Charlotte, so we can all acknowledge and celebrate it." So many people are evidently very invested in believing in Charlotte's mixed ethnicity, and I think this is because it allows them to see themselves represented in history if they are black or mixed too, and this is something I can completely understand. There's not enough representation of non-white historical figures in mainstream media, in my opinion, and I think that's why this pseudo-history story has gained such traction, despite the gaping holes in it which are very clear once you start drilling down into the claims. Unfortunately, as nice as it would be if Charlotte had actually been mixed race and accepted for it in her lifetime, because it would have represented such a fantastic step forwards in the long and ongoing road to racial equality that we're still on today, I simply don't believe it's true. As for Bridgerton's portrayal of her, I love that show and its prequel, and I think the actresses who have portrayed that imaginary version of the Queen, which also bears no resemblance to her personality by the way, have done a fantastic job, and I look forward to seeing more seasons of the show. That said, I wish that instead of using a real queen as the basis for the character in a programme filled with otherwise fictional characters, barring Charlotte's family, the showrunners had just invented a queen specifically for that world. As I explained in more detail in my video about how historical fiction misleads people, this is because while I don't mind colourblind casting of fictional characters, I think we're on a slippery slope when we start doing it with real people. If there's anything we can take away from this video, apart from the fact that Queen Charlotte was a white European woman, it's that people are often very susceptible to lies, even in the face of a great deal of evidence telling them the truth. Tell them a fantasy story that they want to believe is true, and a lot of them will swallow it whole and refuse to spit it back up. Despite all the evidence I've given here to show why Charlotte was white, I guarantee you that I'll still get complaints from people in the comments who don't just disagree with me, which is fine by the way and certainly are right, but who will be nasty about it, as though giving a reasoned argument with lots of sources and showing why the pseudo-evidence is just that is a personal attack on them. If you're one of those people, I would ask you to think about why the lousy and almost entirely unreferenced and sometimes even demonstrably false statements made by Valdes Cocum and his adherents is so palatable to you, yet you're struggling so much to acknowledge the value of the masses of, I think, much more convincing research that I've provided. If real history and truth actually matter to you, you should at least be able to admit by now that the argument that Charlotte was black is, at a bare minimum, deeply, deeply flawed. Now, if you can reason away all the evidence I've provided and give us real quality evidence that Charlotte was black, okay, do that. As long as you're polite about it, I may not agree, but I'll still respect your right to your opinion. If all you've got are insults, more fairy tales, and blanket statements that I'm wrong without any sensible, coherent explanation as to why, backed up by original primary sources, then you're showing the inherent weakness in your own desired belief, not to mention your lack of manners, class, and how poorly you were raised. I am sorry if you feel you were duped by this story. I don't blame the general public for getting sucked into this, given how many high-profile outlets and public figures repeated it without bothering to really investigate it. But that's not my fault, so please don't take your disappointment out on me for trying to guide you to what I firmly believe is the truth, and providing a much stronger rationale for my arguments than any I have ever seen given by those claiming Charlotte was visibly biracial. All that being said, if further credible evidence came to light which better supported the idea of her appearing biracial, I would be more than happy to revise the position I've put forth in this video. But until then, my opinion is that she was a white European woman. Okay, let's open the floodgates here because I'm going to ask you to let me know what you make of the evidence regarding her ethnic background and remind you again to keep your comments measured and civil, not just towards me, but towards other commenters too. For more on the Queen, on how the media treats history, and on other pseudo-history stories, try one of these videos next. And until next time, keep learning.